Chapter 1. Captured and Shipped. German POWs Journey to America. During World War II, thousands of German soldiers found themselves captured by Allied forces in North Africa and Europe. Many of them expected to spend the rest of the war in overcrowded, poorly supplied camps near the front lines or in war-ravaged parts of Europe. What they didn't anticipate was being loaded onto ships and sent across the Atlantic Ocean to the United States of America. The journey from the battlefields of Europe to the heart of American soil was one filled with uncertainty, fear, and confusion. For many of these German prisoners of war, POWs, their only exposure to America before capture came through Nazi propaganda or old silent films. In the Reich's media, the U.S. was often portrayed as a nation of corruption, racial division, and economic instability, a capitalist power in decline. Few expected what they were about to witness. German POWs were first processed and detained in temporary camps in Europe or North Africa before being shipped to the U.S. via secure naval convoys. Most were captured in campaigns such as Operation Torch in North Africa, the invasion of Sicily, or the D-Day landings. By the time they boarded ships bound for the United States, they had already endured long marches, sparse rations, and a sense of growing despair about the war's outcome. Once on board, the trip was grueling but relatively safe. The German prisoners were often surprised by the humane treatment they received. In contrast to how Axis forces treated their own prisoners, often with brutality or indifference, American guards followed the Geneva Convention protocols. Prisoners were fed regularly, allowed time on deck, and even given books or games to pass the time. This was already a shock to many. But the real astonishment began when they approached the American coastline. Sailing into ports like New York, Norfolk, or New Orleans, many POWs had their first glimpse of American industrial infrastructure. Massive harbors filled with cargo ships, towering cranes, humming factories, and endless trains waiting to move goods. The scale of production was unimaginable. For soldiers raised under the belief that America was weak and fragmented, the first sight of the U.S. was a revelation. One German POW recalled decades later, "When we sailed into New York Harbor and saw the Statue of Liberty, the skyline, and the endless ships, we realized we had been lied to. This was not a crumbling society. This was a giant." The trip from port to POW camp offered more surprises. On trains and buses moving through the heartland, POWs saw bustling cities, seemingly endless highways, rows of new cars, and productive farmland stretching for miles. Many prisoners had never seen such abundance, especially during wartime. Back in Germany, cities were already devastated by bombing raids, food was rationed, and entire towns lived in darkness and fear. Some POWs even mistook what they were seeing. They believed the Americans were staging scenes, showing off their best trains, their healthiest citizens, their most productive farms, just to impress the prisoners. But the scale and consistency of it all made it clear. This was everyday America. By the time the POWs arrived at their camps, usually located in rural areas like Texas, Kansas, or Georgia, the shock had already set in. They had been transported from the front lines of a collapsing European empire to the heart of a thriving, unstoppable industrial superpower. This initial impression would shape their entire experience in captivity, and for many, it would leave a lasting impact that changed their views on America forever. Chapter 2. Inside the Camps. Life in America for German POWs. After their long and often surreal journey across the Atlantic, German prisoners of war were settled into camps scattered across the American countryside. By 1945, more than 400,000 Axis POWs, the vast majority of them German, were held in over 500 camps across the United States. Though many feared the worst, what they found inside these camps was far from what they had expected. For starters, the camps were surprisingly orderly, clean, and, in many cases, comfortable. Constructed rapidly by the U.S. military, most facilities were modeled after standard U.S. Army training camps. They consisted of barracks, dining halls, recreation areas, and even libraries. Some were in remote locations, far from cities, to prevent escapes. Others were on the outskirts of towns, where prisoners would soon become part of the local labor force. Unlike in Nazi Germany's treatment of captured soldiers, the United States strictly adhered to the Geneva Convention. German POWs received adequate food, medical care, and housing. They were allowed to send and receive mail, access Red Cross packages, and worship freely. In fact, they were even paid a small wage in scrip, camp currency, for any labor performed, which they could use in the camp canteen to buy candy, cigarettes, toiletries, or newspapers. For many, daily life in the camps felt strangely normal, almost too normal for men who had just come from war. Some prisoners were suspicious of this treatment at first. Nazi propaganda had prepared them for a brutal, chaotic, racially divided America. Instead, they were being treated with a level of decency that contradicted everything they had been told. For young soldiers who had grown up during the rise of the Third Reich, this caused an internal conflict. If their enemy was not evil, then what did that mean about the war they were fighting? The U.S. military had its reasons for treating the POWs well. Aside from following international law, they believed good treatment would reduce the risk of rebellion and encourage cooperation. It worked. In fact, American officials found that many prisoners began to self-police. Pro-Nazi factions within the camps did exist, often marked by secret salutes or underground propaganda. But the general atmosphere leaned toward order and adaptation rather than resistance. The daily routine was structured: morning roll calls, chores, meals, and often assigned labor. Many POWs were put to work on nearby farms, in factories, or on public works projects. With so many American men off fighting the war, the domestic labor shortage was severe, and German prisoners helped fill the gap. Working in American communities exposed POWs even further to the realities of U.S. life. They saw civilian workers, women driving tractors, African Americans living freely, things that ran counter to the narratives they'd been fed. For many, this further deepened shock. America wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Camp commanders often offered educational opportunities. Some POWs attended classes in English, mathematics, or American civics. Others participated in theater productions, orchestras, or sports leagues. This cultural exposure had a lasting effect. One former POW later said, "I came here with hate in my heart. I left with confusion and admiration." Not all camps were perfect. Tensions sometimes flared between pro-Nazi and anti-Nazi groups, and some prisoners faced harsh punishment or solitary confinement. But overall, the experience was eye-opening. What stunned the POWs most wasn't just the material wealth. It was the sense of freedom and dignity granted even to prisoners. They began to understand that America's industrial power was only one part of its strength. The real shock came from witnessing a society where prosperity was built not just through force, but through opportunity, cooperation, and belief in democratic ideals. Chapter 3: The Industrial Machine, America at Full Production Power. What left the deepest impression on many German prisoners of war was not just the comfortable camps or humane treatment. It was the overwhelming power of American industry. From the moment they stepped onto U.S. soil, they saw evidence of a country operating at full capacity, producing more than they thought possible, and doing it with a level of efficiency that simply didn't exist in wartime Germany. For many of these men, their only frame of reference was their homeland, a country strangled by Allied bombing, rationing, and declining morale. German factories were being destroyed from the air. Transportation routes were fractured, and materials were scarce. By contrast, American trains ran on time, roads were in excellent condition, cities were brightly lit at night, and food seemed abundant. Some POWs were stationed in or near industrial towns, places like Detroit, Pittsburgh, or smaller factory hubs across the Midwest and South. Others were assigned to work in war-related industries under guard, repairing equipment or helping with menial tasks like sorting scrap metal. Even from the sidelines, they could see how immense and organized the American industrial effort was. The scale stunned them. Assembly lines stretching hundreds of feet, warehouses the size of airplane hangars, trains rolling in and out all day, loaded with tanks, trucks, and crates of ammunition. Entire ships being built in weeks. Women working in overalls, operating cranes and machinery with ease. Teenage boys managing freight. Elderly men welding metal. To the average German soldier, raised to believe that Americans were soft, lazy, or disorganized, it was shocking. One POW later recalled seeing a convoy of brand new trucks pass by, all painted in olive drab, each one perfectly identical. He asked his guard, "When will these be delivered to the front?" The guard casually replied, "Those? They'll probably sit in storage. We've got more than we need right now." The German soldier was speechless. In Nazi Germany, even frontline units sometimes lacked basic vehicles or ammunition. This wasn't just about raw materials or natural wealth. The POWs saw how deeply integrated America's entire economy was into the war effort. Factories that had once made typewriters now made rifles. Auto plants produced tanks and bombers. Food production was mechanized and modern. Civilian workers were trained quickly and worked in shifts around the clock. It seemed that every town, every city, every worker had a role to play, and the results were undeniable. What made this more incredible was that America was fighting a two-front war against both Germany and Japan, while still managing to produce more than any other nation on Earth. German POWs came to realize that the Allies' material superiority wasn't propaganda. It was real, and it was unstoppable. They also couldn't help but compare this with the centralized, authoritarian control they knew in Nazi Germany. In the Third Reich, industries were state-directed, and inefficiency and corruption were widespread. In America, though the government coordinated production, much of it still ran through private companies competing with each other. Somehow, this decentralized system worked even better, faster, freer, and with fewer shortages. The message became clear: America wasn't just rich in resources. It was rich in innovation, organization, and adaptability. This realization often led to mixed feelings among the prisoners. Pride in their own homeland was now tempered by awe at what they were seeing. Some felt anger that they had been lied to by their leaders. Others felt relief that maybe in defeat they would return home to rebuild something better. And a few began to admire the very nation they had once sworn to destroy. The longer they stayed, the more they understood America's industrial might wasn't just about numbers. It was about a way of thinking, one that valued speed, efficiency, individual initiative, and mass collaboration. For many POWs, that was more shocking than any bomb or battle they had ever experienced. Chapter 4: From Farmers to Factories, POW Labor and the American Workforce. As World War II raged on, the United States faced a major labor shortage. With millions of American men deployed overseas, the agricultural and industrial sector struggled to maintain production levels necessary to support both civilian life and the war effort. In response, the U.S. government turned to a unique and unexpected labor source: German prisoners of war. Under the rules of the Geneva Convention, POWs could be required to perform non-military labor as long as it didn't directly support combat operations, and they were treated humanely. America followed these rules carefully and began assigning thousands of German POWs to work across the country, from sprawling farms in Iowa to lumber yards in Oregon, and even inside factories producing war materials indirectly. For the prisoners, this labor was a strange but eye-opening experience. Many had never worked in agriculture or industry at this scale. Some were former university students, office workers, or soldiers fresh from the front lines. Others had worked in pre-war German factories, but found the American way of doing things almost unrecognizable, faster, more flexible, and often more innovative. On American farms, POWs picked cotton, harvested wheat, cut sugarcane, and did maintenance work. Farmers initially resisted the idea of using enemy soldiers on their land, but that changed quickly when they saw the manpower crisis deepen. Over time, both sides adapted. Prisoners appreciated the outdoor work and fresh air, and many farmers came to respect the POWs for their discipline and strong work ethic. Still, The contrast between what they saw and what they had been told was difficult to ignore. A German prisoner assigned to work on a Kansas wheat farm wrote in his diary, "We were told America was a land of decay and unemployment. But here, everything works. Machines we've never seen before. Storage full of grain. The farmer's children have bicycles. Their wife drives a truck. This is not weakness. This is wealth." In industrial settings, the impression was even stronger. POWs cleaning machine shops or unloading materials from rail cars got to see up close how American factories operated. They watched women and teenagers running precision machinery, sometimes with more skill than seasoned German workers. Many were stunned by how efficiently these civilian crews functioned and how much trust was placed in them. In Germany, strict hierarchies and rigid procedures often slowed production. In contrast, American workers seemed empowered to solve problems quickly, suggest improvements, and switch roles when needed. To the POWs, this flexibility felt chaotic at first, but they couldn't argue with the results. The prisoners were compensated modestly for their work with camp-issued scrip. They used it to buy chocolate, cigarettes, stationery, or small luxuries from the camp canteen. Though far from free men, many found the work routine gave them a sense of dignity and normalcy in the middle of a global war. Interactions with civilians were tightly controlled, but not unheard of. Some POWs formed unexpected friendships with guards, farmers, or factory supervisors. A few communities even began to see the German prisoners not as faceless enemies, but as young men caught up in a war they hadn't started. Likewise, many POWs began to soften their view of Americans, seeing in them not the propaganda version of greed and chaos, but people with families, values, and a strong work ethic. This labor experience became one of the most significant aspects of captivity. The POWs were not only witnessing American industry, they were participating in it. Every tractor repaired, crate moved, or field harvested added to their understanding of just how vast and capable the American system was. By the end of the war, many German prisoners would say that their months working in America taught them more about the real United States than any book or lecture ever could. They didn't just observe industrial might. They became part of it, however briefly. And that, more than anything, reshaped their view of the world. Chapter 5: Shattered Myths. The collapse of Nazi propaganda in American captivity. For years before and during World War II, German citizens, including the soldiers who would become POWs, were inundated with Nazi propaganda about the United States. The Third Reich's Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, led by Joseph Goebbels, worked tirelessly to create a distorted image of America as a morally bankrupt, racially divided, economically crumbling society that lacked culture, unity, or power. It was painted as a decaying capitalist empire on the brink of collapse, ruled by Jewish financiers and corrupted by inferior races. But for German prisoners of war who found themselves in American custody, this illusion began to break almost immediately. From the moment they stepped off the ships in American ports, German POWs were confronted with the stark contrast between what they had been told and what they were witnessing with their own eyes. Clean streets, massive cities, well-fed civilians, organized systems, functional infrastructure, and above all, industrial abundance and technological advancement. For many, this was deeply unsettling. If the core beliefs they had been raised on were wrong, what else had they been lied to about? In the camps, this unraveling continued. The humane treatment they received was in direct opposition to what they had been taught to expect from brutal capitalist enemies. Guards were firm but respectful. Medical care was available. Food was regular and, to their amazement, plentiful. Educational programs were offered. Even entertainment was allowed. Some camps screened American films, which, despite being censored or carefully chosen, showed a level of diversity, creativity, and freedom that German state media could never match. Most significantly, the racial dynamics they observed confused many POWs. Nazi propaganda had constantly emphasized America's racial chaos, highlighting poverty, crime, and supposed degeneration among minorities. But many POWs saw black and white Americans working side by side, particularly in cities or on integrated farms and factory crews. Though racism certainly existed in the U.S., it didn't match the apocalyptic portrait painted by the Nazis. These contradictions created deep cognitive dissonance for some German prisoners, especially those who had fully believed in the Nazi worldview. Conversations inside the camps often turned philosophical. If the enemy is not what we were told, what does that say about us? Over time, this breakdown in belief created clear divides within the camps. Some prisoners clung tightly to their Nazi identities, accusing others of being weak or brainwashed by the enemy. These pro-Nazi groups sometimes operated underground, spreading leaflets, holding secret meetings, or threatening more moderate prisoners. In response, American camp authorities began separating the most hardened ideologues from the rest, placing them in special high-security sections to prevent intimidation and violence. On the other hand, a growing number of prisoners openly distanced themselves from Nazi ideology. Many began to read American literature, take English classes, and ask questions about American democracy and history. A few even participated in re-education programs later established by U.S. authorities, designed to encourage democratic thinking and prepare POWs to return to a post-Hitler Germany. One former POW recalled, "I believed everything the Reich told me, but then I saw what America really was. It was not weak, it was strong, not divided but driven. The people were free to speak, to work, to worship. I began to question everything." For these men, the collapse of Nazi myths was not just a political transformation, it was a personal one. It reshaped how they saw the world, their country, and themselves. By the end of the war, thousands of former POWs would return to Germany carrying a very different story than the one they had arrived with. The industrial might of America was undeniable, but it was the moral, cultural, and social strength, so long denied by Nazi propaganda, that truly opened their eyes. Chapter 6: Education and Re-Education. Learning Behind Barbed Wire. Life behind barbed wire in American POW camps was far from idle. While many German prisoners spent their days working on farms or in factories, a surprising number took part in something completely unexpected: education. For many, this experience became one of the most transformative aspects of their captivity, especially when combined with the collapse of the ideological narratives they had once believed. The educational programs in U.S. POW camps range from basic literacy classes to advanced university-style lectures. Some were prisoner-led, while others were organized by American military personnel. At first, these efforts were mostly practical: English lessons, math, vocational training, designed to occupy the prisoners and prepare them for reintegration into post-war life. But over time, the educational programs became more ambitious. The U.S. Office of War Information, in cooperation with the War Department, eventually introduced a formal re-education initiative, sometimes referred to as the Intellectual Diversion Program. The goal was not to brainwash or force American values onto the prisoners, but to expose them to democratic ideals, accurate history, and critical thinking skills that had been denied to them under the Nazi regime. Books, newspapers, and magazines in German were supplied to the camps, carefully selected to exclude Nazi propaganda, but broad enough to encourage discussion. Educational films were shown, and debates were held. Some camps even established full libraries with thousands of volumes in German and English. Topics range from political theory and world history to American culture and modern science. At first, many prisoners were skeptical. Some still clung to Nazi ideology and dismissed the programs as manipulation. But others, especially the younger, more educated, or already disillusioned POWs, began to participate eagerly. These men had seen the failures of the regime up close and were now open to questioning what they had been taught. One POW wrote later, "For the first time, I read a history book not written by the party. I saw maps that showed the truth. I read about Lincoln, Jefferson, and the Constitution. I realized I knew nothing of real freedom." The American approach was surprisingly patient. Rather than force ideology, they allowed the material to speak for itself. Prisoners were encouraged to ask questions, challenge ideas, and engage in open dialogue, a radical contrast to the closed, authoritarian environment of Nazi Germany. Not all camps embraced the program equally. In some locations, strong pro-Nazi factions sabotaged re-education efforts. Camp administrators had to walk a careful line to maintain order while still promoting democratic exposure. Eventually, the most vocal Nazi loyalists were transferred to separate, higher security camps to prevent intimidation. By the later stages of the war, the educational efforts were bearing fruit. In certain camps, volunteer newspapers written by prisoners themselves reflected growing interest in post-war reconstruction, democracy, and peace. Some German POWs even formed discussion circles where they debated the future of Germany and their role in rebuilding it. The Allies understood that winning the war wasn't enough. The real victory would come through shaping a peaceful, stable Germany that would never again fall under fascist rule. In this light, the time German POWs spent in the U.S. was seen not only as containment, but as an opportunity for rehabilitation and renewal. For many prisoners, the chance to study, read freely, and explore ideas was not just a luxury. It was liberating. Their worldviews had been shaped in a system where critical thinking was dangerous and dissent was punished. Now, behind barbed wire, they were experiencing intellectual freedom for the first time in their lives. And for some, that experience would follow them home, influencing how they raised their children, how they voted, and how they viewed the world in the decades to come. Chapter 7: Going Home, Return, Reflection, and Reintegration. When World War II ended in 1945, German prisoners of war held in the United States faced a new kind of uncertainty: repatriation. After years of life in American camps, working, learning, and in many cases, reshaping their worldviews, they were now going home to a country in ruins, divided in ideology, and filled with questions they themselves were still trying to answer. The process of returning POWs to Germany was gradual. The U.S. didn't immediately send prisoners home after VE Day. Instead, many remained in American camps until 1946 or even 1947 as part of broader international agreements. Others were transferred to Britain or France, where they continued labor service to help rebuild those nations before eventually being released. Some were repatriated in waves, depending on their rank, level of Nazi affiliation, and labor utility. Leaving America, the final months in U.S. custody were bittersweet for many. Though still technically prisoners, the POWs had built routines, friendships, and in some cases, a grudging admiration for the country that had once been their enemy. Some felt deep gratitude for how they had been treated. Others were anxious, even afraid, to return to a Germany they no longer recognized or ideologically aligned with. Before departure, many camps held farewell ceremonies or allowed prisoners to write final letters. Some former guards and POWs exchanged addresses, hoping to stay in touch. A surprising number would do so for decades, forming lifelong friendships that defied the war's legacy. As one former POW put it, "I came as a soldier, angry and proud. I left as a man, uncertain but changed. America was my prison and my teacher, homecoming to a broken nation. Returning to Germany was not always a joyful reunion. Cities lay in rubble. The economy had collapsed. Families had been scattered, killed, or traumatized. The Third Reich was gone, replaced by Allied occupation zones, and in the East, a growing Soviet presence. The proud, aggressive nation many of them had left was now a shell of itself. Some returning POWs were welcomed cautiously. Others faced suspicion or resentment, especially if they had been away from the horrors of late-war Germany. Some people accused them of sitting out the hard years in comfort. In contrast, others recognized the POW's exposure to the outside world as valuable. Seeds of democracy. Among the most significant long-term impacts of the POW experience was the role these men played in post-war reconstruction, particularly in West Germany. Many former prisoners who had been educated or re-educated in the United States returned with radically different views of governance, citizenship, and freedom. These were not the same soldiers who had marched under Nazi banners. They had seen democratic institutions at work. They had learned about free speech, civic responsibility, and pluralism. And many became quietly, or even openly, advocates for a new Germany, one not based on militarism or racial supremacy, but on democratic ideals and economic cooperation. Some became teachers. Others entered politics, business, or journalism. A few joined the Social Democratic Party, SPD, or the New Christian Democratic Union, CDU. Their impact was subtle at first, not loud revolutions, but quiet transformations in how people thought, discussed, and voted. In later interviews, many admitted that it was their time in America that laid the groundwork for this change. Democracy is not weakness. It is strength held in restraint. We learned that not from books, but from watching our captors. Memory and legacy. In the decades following the war, thousands of former POWs maintained contact with American families, guards, and even towns where they had once worked. Some returned to visit. A few even emigrated, choosing to live in the country they had once fought against. In both Germany and the U.S., stories began to emerge. Memoirs, oral histories, documentaries, revealing the complex human dimension of the POW experience. These accounts helped bridge the divide between former enemies, turning stories of war into lessons of reconciliation. While not every German POW was reformed or transformed in captivity, a significant number carried home more than just memories. They brought back a new lens through which to view the world, one shaped not by ideology, but by experience, and that may have done more to shape post-war Europe than any battlefield victory ever could. Chapter 8: Echoes in the Heartland. The Legacy of German POWs in American Communities. Though the German prisoners of war returned home after the guns fell silent, their presence in the United States left a quiet but lasting imprint on the communities that had once housed them. Across rural fields, factory towns, and small cities, the impact of these unexpected wartime guests would echo for decades in ways both visible and deeply personal. A temporary presence that felt permanent. By the end of the war, over 500 POW camps had operated across 46 states. While many camps were built in isolated areas for security reasons, quite a few were nestled near towns where POWs worked side by side with civilians, under supervision, but often with growing familiarity. Farmers, mill owners, and municipal workers who had initially viewed the Germans with fear or suspicion began to see them differently. Not as enemies, but as young men caught up in a war not of their making. This shift often started with simple, human moments. A prisoner helping a farmer repair a broken fence. A POW offering a handkerchief to a child. A shared joke through broken English. Over time, bonds formed, cautious at first, but sincere. While U.S. authorities imposed strict regulations on fraternization, human nature had other plans. Letters were exchanged. Small gifts were given. Local churches quietly held joint prayer services. In some cases, romantic relationships even blossomed, though they were frowned upon and often separated by repatriation. One Iowa woman later recalled, "He wasn't a Nazi to me. He was a boy with tired eyes who fixed our windmill." From prisoners to friends. In the post-war years, many Americans who had interacted with POWs kept memories, and in some cases, mementos. Hand-carved toys, paintings, or small pieces of furniture made by German hands became family heirlooms. Children who had been too young to understand the war remembered the strange men behind the fence who smiled and waved. Some towns even held farewell ceremonies when the prisoners were finally sent home. In a few places, local residents wrote to the War Department asking to delay a camp's closure, not out of strategic necessity, but because they had grown fond of the prisoners. In the South and Midwest especially, where agricultural labor was crucial, the contributions of POWs during harvest seasons were not forgotten. Entire crops had been saved by their efforts. Infrastructure projects, roads, bridges, irrigation ditches, had been completed with their help. These weren't just temporary laborers. They were wartime collaborators in the truest civilian sense. Cultural curiosity and exchange. Beyond labor, The German prisoners unintentionally served as cultural ambassadors. Many were educated, polite, and curious. They asked questions about American customs. They introduced townspeople to German music, poetry, and even recipes. While propaganda had painted Germans as brutal automatons, many Americans found themselves surprised by their manners, intellect, and humor. In response, POWs encountered the diversity and contradictions of American life firsthand, encountering not only generosity and fairness, but also racism, economic inequality, and the limits of American idealism. For both sides, it was a crash course in cultural complexity. Lasting connections. When repatriation finally came, many POWs left letters behind. Some continued corresponding with American guards, farmers, and townspeople for years. A few even returned after the war, legally, as immigrants, seeking to build new lives in the land where they had once been confined. One former POW, who had worked on a Nebraska farm, came back in the 1950s, married the daughter of the farmer he had once worked for, and opened a hardware store in town. He lived there until his death in the 1990s, a quiet reminder of a strange time when enemy soldiers became neighbors. In some communities, memorials or plaques were erected to mark former campsites. Others quietly let them fade back into the landscape, remembered only in local oral histories. In recent years, historians and descendants have rekindled interest, organizing museum exhibits and recording interviews with surviving witnesses. A softening of hearts and minds. Perhaps the most important legacy of the German POWs in America wasn't physical at all. It was emotional and ideological. For American civilians who interacted with the prisoners, especially in rural areas with little exposure to foreigners, the war became less abstract. It wasn't just about distant battlefields. It was about the young German man who worked beside them in a field or repaired their barn. And for the POWs, America wasn't just a set of ideological talking points or targets in enemy propaganda. It was a place with flaws and contradictions, yes, but also one with opportunity, freedom, and decency. In the long shadow of the war, those small, human moments added up. They didn't undo the horrors of conflict, but they planted seeds of reconciliation and mutual understanding that would quietly grow in the decades that followed. Chapter 9. Return and Renewal. German former POWs settling in the United States after the war. While most German prisoners of war were repatriated to their homeland after 1945, a notable number chose a different path. They returned to the United States to build new lives. This migration reflected the complicated legacies of war, displacement, and opportunity, transforming some former captives into integral members of American society. From captivity to citizenship, the process of repatriation was often bittersweet. Germany lay in ruins, politically fragmented and economically devastated. Many returning POWs faced homelessness, food shortages, and shattered families. For some, the memory of their relative comfort, even captivity, in America was a stark contrast. Letters between former prisoners and American friends sometimes revealed a yearning not to go back. I dream of a place where I can work honestly and live in peace. Perhaps America could be that place. After the war, U.S. immigration policies gradually opened doors for certain European refugees, including some former POWs. Many took advantage of the Displaced Persons Act of 1948, which allowed war refugees to enter the U.S. legally. Challenges and opportunities. The transition from prisoner to immigrant was not easy. Former POWs had to learn a new language, find employment, and integrate into unfamiliar communities. Some found work in agriculture or manufacturing, often near where their camps had been located. However, unlike many immigrants, these men had a unique story that sometimes caused suspicion or curiosity. Communities who remembered them as prisoners were surprised to see them return voluntarily. It challenged prevailing narratives about enemy soldiers and humanized a generation often viewed solely through the lens of war. In some cases, former POWs married American women, creating families bridging two worlds. Their children grew up bilingual, with a dual heritage combining the old and new. Cultural contributions. Former POW immigrants contributed to American life in subtle but meaningful ways. They brought with them skills in crafts, engineering, music, and the arts. Several became local business owners, teachers, or community leaders. Their presence enriched cultural diversity, particularly in rural and Midwestern areas. Some helped establish German-American clubs, promoting cultural exchange and helping dispel lingering wartime prejudices. They also became advocates for peace and reconciliation, sharing stories that emphasize common humanity. Reconciliation through stories. Over time, the narratives of former POWs who settled in the U.S. became sources of healing and understanding. Memoirs and oral histories recorded by descendants and historians reveal a complex picture of resilience, adaptation, and hope. One former prisoner, who later became a respected professor in Minnesota, reflected, "War had taken much from me, but it also showed me what kindness can look like. America gave me a second chance." Legacy in modern America. Today, the descendants of these former POWs are often proud of their unique heritage. Annual reunions and heritage festivals celebrate the intertwined German-American experience born out of wartime hardship. The story of German POWs who chose to stay in the United States is a testament to the unpredictable paths of history, how conflict can lead to connection and captivity to community.